Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation stories of the past week by the AIN editors who covered them. I'm AIN Alerts editor Chad Trautvetter. In this week's episode, London-based editor Charles Alcock gives an overview of a study looking into reduced aircraft emissions as flying dropped during the COVID-19 crisis. He also gives us the latest business aviation traffic from WingX Advance. I'll provide details about Textron Aviation's new Beechcraft King Air 360 and 360ER announced this week. Editor-in-Chief Matt Thurber explains the significance of Aspen Avionics joining the Airo consortium, and senior editor Kerry Lynch provides highlights of Bombardier's second quarter results and talks about the FAA's roadmap for Boeing 737 MAX recertification. Hey Charlie, there was a report out this week about the environmental situation given the COVID pandemic, and traffic's down, so the emissions are down, right?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, this is something that many people who are analyzing the environmental impact of aviation really wanted to understand, because of COVID, we've had this sort of freakish historical opportunity to see what it would be like if suddenly flying activity were way down, as some environmentalists say it needs to be. And a company called Spire Aviation offered to share some data with me, because what they did was they picked two dates. They picked the 5th of January 2020, which was, before COVID was even something that any of us knew anything about. And they analyzed the number of aircraft flying on that one particular day just in Western Europe. And then they did exactly the same exercise again for April the 25th. And using performance data for the aircraft that they were tracking, and by the way, it was all types of aircraft, airliners, private aircraft, military aircraft, all types of aircraft, what they showed was that between those two dates, whereas traffic was 43% less on April 25th than it had been on January the 5th, amazingly, carbon emissions were 70% down. So that really illustrates and underlines, the extraordinary difference that you see when flight activity is down by as much of that.
Why is traffic down, 40%, but the emissions are down 70%? Is that because a lot of the flights were long haul flights that are no longer being done? Did they say anything about that?
Well, in part, yeah. So what they did was they made certain assumptions as they calculated this. So first of all, they said, okay, let's assume that average utilization per aircraft is 10 flight hours per day. Let's assume that the average distance flown per flight is 1,000 nautical miles. And let's assume that each aircraft is doing 4 separate flights in the course of the day. They had certain assumptions. And yes, they did observe that, generally long haul flights have been down by more than the shorter haul ones. But also, I think what it shows is that, not all aircraft are the same in terms of the emissions that they have. And so, there's not always going to be a direct correlation between the amount of traffic and the amount of emissions. It's not always going to be totally aligned that way.
So what does this mean long term then? What do we learn from this, I guess? What's the path forward to a cleaner future?
Well, I think really it's the proverbial wake-up call. The environmentalists are going to look at this data and they're going to say, yep, told you so. See what happens if you drastically reduce the amount of flying. Sure enough, you bring the emissions down by even more. So the lesson for those of us who want aviation to keep going is, unless we're going to be forced into a position where not due to something like COVID, flight activity has to be reduced, we're going to have to come up with much, much better technology and other solutions that will achieve the same sort of scale of reduction in aircraft emissions. And it's going to be very challenging. We all know what those things are. It's things like, very quickly modernizing fleets so that there's cleaner aircraft flying, getting much smarter air traffic control so that, we don't have aircraft flying around in a chronically inefficient way. It means things like advancing new propulsion systems, electric or hydrogen, to improve the environmental performance of aviation. And what this story tells us is we better get on with that, because otherwise we're going to be backed into a corner having to have drastic cuts in the amount of flying.
Yeah, did the flight shaming community have anything to say about these numbers?
I haven't seen anything yet. I mean, not to hoot our own horn here, but I believe we're the first media group that's actually reported these numbers. So it'll be interesting to see if anybody picks these up. But this really does prove the point that the Green Lobby has been making, and there's just simply no denying it.
Well, while we're on the subject of air traffic, the WingX data for business aviation traffic in worldwide and for Europe came out this week. What's going on with the business aviation segment as far as traffic?
Well, lots of different things is the short answer. So at face value, there is relatively good news here in WingX's latest global market tracker. So they looked at the whole period throughout July and into the first days of August. And overall, activity levels for business aircraft overall, worldwide, were just 18% below where they'd been for the same period in 2019. Now, of course, in a world where COVID had never existed, we'd all be saying, that's terrible. How could it be 18% down? But we know that that's directly COVID related. And actually, it was far worse than that several weeks and months ago. So that is an improvement. But it's not the same all over the world. So the European market, which has always been heavily dependent on having a really strong summer season, has indeed seen some more positive market behavior. So, for example, Europe is only about 11% down on where it was last year versus that 18% number. And even within Europe, there are variations. Central Europe, Germany, Switzerland, Austria is doing a lot better than places like the UK and Spain. Then if you look at the US market, again, it's a very mixed picture. So, and this tracks what's happening with COVID in the US. It's not a uniform picture, but states in the East, like Florida and New York and New Jersey, still struggling with business aircraft traffic. Same's true to some extent in Texas and California. But then there are certain markets like Colorado, for example, where summer demand has actually increased traffic. And so the levels of decline compared with last year are not as steep at all. But what WingX is saying is that's all fine, folks, but we're only talking about the summer season where there are certain, spikes in demand related to vacations and things like that. They're saying we have to wait until the fall to really understand what's happened with business travel in business aircraft. And that's going to be fascinating come, September and early October.
Right, and a lot of business travel is international, so the international restrictions would have to be eased or eliminated for that to kind of really facilitate business traffic, right?
That's definitely true. I mean, we have to remind ourselves that, right now, a massive proportion of the world's population, for example, can't even travel to the US, even if it wanted to. And then there are all sorts of other travel restrictions. The WingX data clearly shows that intercontinental traffic generally is still way down. There's a very mixed picture across Asia. Chinese domestic flying not doing so badly, but intercontinental flying way down. And this just isn't the recovery, such as it is. Clearly, is just not going to happen in a uniform and consistent way because the main impulse for the decline, namely the COVID virus, isn't behaving in a uniform and consistent way.
Right. So this is a good place for you to ask me about the new King Airs, Charlie.
Absolutely. So, Chad, despite all this continued uncertainty, I understand that at least one manufacturer this week actually found the right moment to launch a totally new aircraft. Tell us about that.
Yeah, actually, this is a program they've been working on for a while. Textron Aviation announced the King Air 360-360ER as an upgrade to the venerable King Air 353ER. 353-50ER. It's their flagship turboprop, and they just added some things in the flight deck for lower pilot workload, such as a digital pressurization system, and also they've added the IS&S auto throttles, which help manage power throughout the whole flight regime. And also, they've taken advantage of previous testing to lower the cabin altitude by about 1,000 feet at flight level.
So it's going to be a better scenario for both the pilots and the passengers then with this new King Air 350 and the ER. And that autothrottle, just to be clear, does that mean not only sort of lower pilot workload, but also that the propulsion system works more efficiently because it's, the system figures out what's actually needed?
Yeah, and also it helps with things when you lose an engine, it'll do auto feather and auto shutdown. It just really takes a lot of the workload out of the equation for the pilots when things go wrong. But also, when things are right, it helps with power management, go arounds, and things like that. Just it makes it more efficient and easier to do. To focus on other areas like flying the airplane. Of
course. And you mentioned the pressurization in the cabin. Have they improved the cabin in other ways? Are the interiors different?
Yeah, actually, the rest of the upgrades really focus on the passenger experience. They've totally redesigned the cabin from top to bottom. They redesigned new seats. They did what they call digital pressure mapping to make the seats more comfortable. They also the interior also has 5 new color schemes, but they've also done a lot of other stuff. They've kind of refined the cabinetry. It's not so squared anymore. It's more rounded. The lighting and the air gaspers are more streamlined. They've added LED lighting, and they also raised the height of the work tables. People complained they were a little bit too low previously, so they've kind of raised those up a bit.
Sure. And is this new model available immediately, or is it going to only go into production, at some point in the future?
Well, they've already started production on it, so they will deliver the first ones this fall. And I think the first launch customer will be they didn't give a name of, but they said it's a private farming company that's in California. So, but they're very, and they also said that as part of this, basically during COVID, they looked at all their products and they're really focusing on how they can improve their existing products versus launching new ones, even though they're already doing, the new Denali turboprop single and also the new Sky Courier turboprop twin.
Mm-hmm. Interesting and very encouraging too.
Yeah, it's good to see companies investing, in this industry, even with deliveries down. It's a good sign that Textron is looking to invest in its products and make them better, and hopefully get more sales. Speaking of avionics updates, Matt, Aspen Avionics has teamed up with a company called Airo as a new kind of consortium. So why do they do that, and what's the consortium about?
Chad, this is kind of interesting because Aspen Avionics has been strictly a general aviation aftermarket avionics manufacturer. They were pioneers when they first came out with their new glass displays, because the displays install really simply in the same instrument panel holes as the existing old style instruments. So they've had a pretty good market and they've done pretty well in general aviation, but to grow beyond that market, they really have to be part of a bigger company with bigger aspirations. And that's what the joining up with Airo Group is all about. Aspen is one of 6 other companies that Airo Group is acquiring in its effort to become a new mid-tier aerospace and defense player with ambitions of going public and quickly ramping up to a valuation of more than $1 billion.
So what are they focusing on? I think it's defense and UAV, right?
Airo Group's goal is to target 3 growth areas in aerospace and defense, and that includes drone technology and urban air mobility, advanced avionics, which is where Aspen fits in, and defense and training, which includes things like adversary air contracting for military services, where they provide the adversary jets that the air forces can send their pilots to fly against. It's much, much less expensive to do that with a contractor than it is for the Air Force to put hours on its own airplanes to do that.
So when does this all happen? When are they going to acquire Aspen and the other companies?
Right now, Chad, the acquisition is all in the form of letters of intent to make the acquisition, and they're trying to wrap it up fairly quickly. I don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but they have a private investment banking firm, Stevens Incorporated, to help raise funds for these acquisitions. But the whole plan has been underway for the past 2 years, so it's not something that suddenly sprang up.
Interesting. Thanks, Matt. So on Thursday, Kerry, Bombardier had its second quarter investor call. So what happened in the second quarter at the company as far as aircraft deliveries?
Well, Chad, I mean, basically it was a terrible quarter for Bombardier, but it wasn't all that unexpected. I mean, Bombardier warned in June that they were cutting back production because they saw industry-wide deliveries scaling back about 30% this year. And so they were trying to match that or approach that. And they also laid off 2,500 people. So that's a significant amount. So anyways, with that backdrop, the deliveries for the second quarter were a total of 20, which is down from 34 in second quarter 2019. And that included 9 globals. And 5 of those, on the good news end, were the 7,500, but that means there were only 4 of the 5,500, 6,500 family. There were also 9 Challengers and a couple of Learjets. And if you compare that, this time last year in the second quarter, they delivered 16 Globals and 17 Challengers. So the Challengers were almost half of what they were last year, and a pair of Learjets as well.
So for the first half, how are they looking?
Well, in the first half, they're down. But when you look at the numbers, it's going to be tilted down towards the second quarter because in total, they delivered 59 business jets in the first half of 2019 versus 46 this year. So that delta of 13 down by 13 is really more than made up in the drop in the second quarter. So in the first half, it doesn't look so bad, but that's because they had a stronger first quarter. But I will say that with the globals, they're starting to ramp up on their flagship, the 7,500. So they delivered 11 of those in total for the first half, and they probably would have delivered more, I'm guessing, because they had to stop if they didn't have to shut down their plants for a short time when the pandemic really took root. And in the second half, you're going to see them trying to catch up a little bit because new president and CEO of Bombardier Inc., Eric Martel, who's returning to the company, said they delivered 11 in the first half, and they think they're going to at least double that amount in the second half. So when you put it all together, they're going to probably deliver well over 30, probably maybe 33, even more of the 7,500, their flagship again, in the second half.
And that puts them close to their run rate for that airplane, right?
Yes, their target was between 35 to 40 a year. So that's pretty close. And considering the other models have struggled a little bit, it's not going to be a bad year, but they had a pretty strong backlog that has waited for years for that airplane. So it's not surprising. And one of the things Eric Martel did say on his call this morning, Thursday morning, with analysts is there's been very few cancellations. So while the deliveries haven't been as fluid, the orders have maintained. However, because they haven't been able to get out and sell airplanes, backlog is still shrinking.
How are they thinking for the second quarter as far as deliveries, and would that include also the new Learjet Liberty that they're developing right now?
Well, the second quarter is a little up in the air. They were pretty specific about the 7,500, not so much the others. Martel said that, they forecast industry-wide that there would be a 30% decline in deliveries overall. And he said, that was forecast in June, and here we are in August. And he said those numbers are still holding true. So they're going to they had shrunk their production. They're going to keep it at that rate. He said he's very comfortable with that rate right now, given the environment. And it's just uncertain. And, you don't know if there's going to be further disruptions because this pandemic is still in a very uncertain place, and they're very cautious about that. And as a matter of fact, he was pressed by analysts, this morning about whether what the outlook is for deliveries and rates, and he really couldn't even speak to next year. He just said we're going to keep where we are for the time being. So if you look in their report, it does say that they expect deliveries to accelerate, but when you hear them talk, and they do express optimism, not only are cancellations slow, but they see pre-owned inventory remaining pretty stable, and they do see some sales activity. And they did mention that new people are expressing interest in buying, new customers from outside who are traditional business aviation customers. So they're starting to see some of that too, but it's not enough optimism for them to change their forecasts, their plans of where they are. Now, as far as the Learjet Liberty, in their report, they're saying that it's still on track for the second half of 2020. And they debuted the mock-up in those past MBA 2019. And of course, if they display it this year, it'll have to be virtually. But the aircraft will sport a nice avionics upgrade, of the Garmin G5000 suite, and have some more bells and whistles, and also have a little more flexibility in seating and pricing, so they're able to move that airplane.
Okay, excellent. So let's go over to Boeing. The FAA put out a NPRM this week for the return of the 737 MAX. So in short, what does the NPRM say about certification of the MAX? Or recertification, I'm sorry.
Well, the NPRM is actually, it's a notice of proposed rulemaking for a proposed airworthiness directive. So basically, it's a fixture airplane NPRM, but it's a very, very important step because it's one component in a very complex series of reviews and different kinds of mandates that must go on before this airplane can get back into the air. But the NPRM is the specific fixes for the airplane itself. And there were 4 key changes that it was looking for, including an update of flight control software, so you can have control laws to prevent erroneous MCAS activation. And of course, it's been widely reported that the MCAS is a key component thought to be in the 2 accidents that led to the review. And it also talks about flight crew procedures to ensure that the flight crew knows what to do and how to respond if there's an erroneous stabilizer movement. There's new display software required that would alert pilots if the AOA sensors are disagreeing and it looks like one is faulty. And of course, an AOA fault was thought to have created erroneous MCAS activation, or they were very closely linked in both those accidents. And then there are some wiring routing changes that are required with the horizontal stabilizer, which would bring it up to the latest standards. And, that's probably a function that the 737 MAX was based on a previous certified aircraft. So you don't necessarily have to have every component in the aircraft to the latest standards. You can go under previous standards during the certification. But anyways, I digress there. Going back to your original question, Chad, what it means for recertification, well, it's huge, because without this, without the fixes to the airplane, you can't get it certified. But it's only one of many pieces of reviews and sign-offs that must go on. And there's training components and there's testing components. And both Boeing and FAA called it a very important step, but they both said there's much work to be done before this plane gets into the air. And as a matter of fact, FAA Administrator Steve Dixon spoke on an MBAA virtual town hall earlier this week, and he referenced the MAX accident, or he was asked about it, and he was pretty plaintive. He said that these accidents should have never happened, and they're going to work to do everything they can to make sure it doesn't happen again. He said once it gets back in the air, he believes that the airplane will be the safest, most thoroughly vetted airplane out there. And he's still planning to fly it, but he wants to make sure he doesn't do it too soon and jump the gun ahead of all the different processes that must take place and the different review boards and everything before he steps on it. There has to be a continued airworthiness notification to the international community issued. There has to be a certificate of airworthiness issued for every export. There has to be operator training program signed off on, because of course that's going to be different. FAA still has to rescind the grounding order, and there still has to be a final flight standardization board and joint operations evaluation board sign off. So there's lots of things that need to happen yet.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. So thanks for the update, Kerry.
Oh, sure.
Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.